I don't know about you, but I'm endeavoring to paint a picture of a Jesus who recognizes the humanity of a person, who recognizes a woman caught in the midst of adultery and says, I love you, I forgive you. Who sees a woman who's been married and divorced 5 times and says, you still have something to offer. That's the kind of Jesus that I want to see. Hello and welcome to another week of Seeing Jesus More Clearly. My name is Dave Nalette and I am so glad you decided to join us today. If you're joining us in real time, this is the week of Thanksgiving, and I just wanted to take a second and wish all of you here in the United States and those of you who celebrate a very happy Thanksgiving, and I pray that it would be a day full of peace and gladness and fellowship with family and friends and people that you value in your life. And if you don't celebrate the Thanksgiving, say you're out of the United States, whatever the case it may be, I pray the same thing over you. You can still have a wonderful day. It's just something special that we get to do here. We get to enjoy that. We're going to dive right on in today, and we're going to be talking about Jesus' ministry, the ministry of Jesus. And we're in the beginning of a new series here focused on the ministry of Jesus. And I want to kind of tackle this subject, if you will, from a new perspective. Acts 10:38, a lot of times, and I'm just as guilty of this as anybody else, when we talk about the ministry of Jesus, we approach it from the perspective that we see here in Acts 10:38, and I love what I heard Brother Kenneth Hagin say years ago, that there's more than one way to approach a mountain. So when we describe a mountain, when we approach it, if you describe a mountain from the south side of the mountain, it'll be completely different from the north side of the mountain. As my spiritual father, Pastor Michael Smith, is fond of saying, our traditional understanding, it's not incorrect, but it is incomplete. And I believe that there is some incompleteness associated with this approach, with viewing it in light purely of Acts 10:38. And I hope we'll get into the why, and then we'll get into the Acts 10:38 stuff here, later on. But Acts 10:38, Peter's talking, right? And it says, and you know how God anointed Jesus of Nazareth, who went about doing 3 things. He went about teaching, preaching, and healing all who were oppressed of the devil, for God was with him. That was the ministry of Jesus here on the earth. He went about teaching, he went about preaching, he went about healing, right? And doing good. Healing all who were oppressed of the devil. This is the focus of so much of our teaching, and I've done this as well. Even in teaching healing school and things at the church that we attend, we sit there on this verse and we harp on this verse and we talk about that this is. These are the works of Jesus. This is what he did here in his ministry. And if this was what Jesus did in his ministry, it's for us today. And I believe that 100%. But I think we need to take a step back, right? We need to take a step back and we need to look at the foundation of Jesus' ministry. Let's look at what leads us to that point, to that foundation, because without a solid foundation, there's no house to be built. Remember the parable that Jesus told, there was the foolish man and the wise man, right? The foolish man built his house on the sand, but the wise man built his house on a firm foundation. I know here in the DFW Metroplex, they're doing a lot of building, right? Coming from Connecticut down to Texas, they are building constantly down here. I mean, it is blowing up. And they go to build these big buildings, these, warehouses, office buildings, et cetera, et cetera. And the one thing you find that's interesting is when they go to build a building tall, the first thing they have to do is dig deep. The first thing they have to do is dig deep, and I believe I heard somewhere, I don't know how accurate this is, so forgive me if it's not 100% correct, but they have to go down almost as deep as the building is tall. And that, I don't know if it's as deep or if there's maybe half the height of it or something along those lines for, commercial rated buildings and whatever have you. But there's a certain amount of depth that it has to have. I know up in the Northeast, foundations had to be below the freeze line. In Texas, here in the Fort Worth area, it's not so much of a concern, right? If the ground's freezing, we've got other troubles on our hands. Yeah, Fort Worthians aren't prepared for snow and things like that. I know the first time I moved down here, or when I first moved down here, there was they called it Ice-mageddon, and there was maybe a foot or so of snow and ice and wintry stuff. And after about a day and a half, I was getting cabin fever, and I was at my in-laws' house, my future in-laws' house at the time, and I was telling Shelby I needed to go somewhere. I wanted to get out, at least let me go to Walmart or something, right? And she said, it's not that, I was like, I can drive in this. This isn't bad at all. And she said, I'm not concerned about you. It's the other idiots who don't know what they're doing, who aren't used to these things and are just going out for fun. But you see, you've got to build that foundation, right? There's got to be a deep foundation in the Northeast. The house foundation has to be under the house, under that freeze line. Here in Texas, when they're building these skyscrapers, they've got to have a foundation to support the skyscraper, because without the foundation, the building has no support. And when life occurs, when life happens, rain and storms and weather and all these things that happen wherever we might be, if there's not a firm foundation, the building will collapse. And it's the same way when it comes to our Christianity. And so while Jesus, yes, he did teach and preach and heal and do all these different things, those are the results of the foundation he laid. Let's look over at John chapter 1. Let's look over at John chapter 1 and verse 14. If you are a longtime viewer here, it's funny to be saying that, but if you're a longtime viewer of Seeing Jesus More Clearly, these verses should be familiar to you. We touched on these in the beginning days of this Bible study, when it was just me and a microphone on a boom arm, right? And a solid white wall behind me, and I was filming it on my iPhone. Now we've stepped up, praise God. John 1:14, it says, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us." Talking about Jesus, right? The Word. This isn't saying that the Bible, these 66 books, became flesh. No, the Word is Jesus. He's talking about Jesus. Jesus became flesh, it says. Jesus dwelt among us. We beheld his glory, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of two things. He was full of grace and full of truth. Full of grace and truth. John bore witness of him and cried out, saying, "This was he whom I said, the one who comes after me is preferred before me, for he was before me." Verse 16, "And of his fullness we've all received grace for grace. For the law was given by Moses, but grace and truth came through Jesus." Grace and truth came through Jesus. So we see that Jesus not only was full of grace and truth, right? But that grace and truth came through him in his life. Grace and truth came through him while he was here on the earth, while he was physically present in the flesh, walking among us. Grace oozed out of his pores. Grace and truth came through Jesus. Well, what does it mean to be full of grace? What does it mean to be full of grace? Have you ever thought about that for a second? I would suffice to say, to be full of grace is to respond how Jesus responds, right? That to be full of grace is that you see the good in situations, that you see the good in other people, that you look to show people goodness and kindness even if they haven't deserved it, even if they haven't lived up to your standards and your expectations. Your heart and your desire and your plan is to still show love and grace and mercy and compassion towards them. That's what it means to be full of grace. And that is our example here from Jesus. This is the foundation of who he is. This is the core, the cornerstone of who he is. He is full of grace. Now, the other thing we'll see here is that grace always chooses love. Grace chooses love. Shelby and I have been in some conversations about different things here recently, and we were talking about a particular subject. I don't recall what it is off the top of my head, but we were talking about it, and how do we respond here? And one of us said it to the other. I don't remember who it was. Sometimes when you're just in such sync in marriage, it's hard to remember kind of where my ideas end and hers begin, and vice versa. We're talking back and forth constantly, and we're giving each other ideas and conceptions and feeding off of them, and it's good. Life is good. But one of us said, if I am to err, if I was to be wrong in this area, I want to be wrong on the side of grace. Now, that's not to say that my aim or my endeavor or my goal is to err. My aim or my endeavor or my goal is to be wrong. But the point is that if I'm wrong, I don't want to be wrong on the side of legalism. I would rather get to heaven, right? I would rather get to heaven and look Jesus in the face and have him say, son, I know that I came full of grace and truth, that I brought grace and truth here to the earth in fullness, but you showed too much grace. You were too gracious. I would rather that be the case than to get to heaven and say, well, didn't you listen to Paul and his explanation of the grace of God and how it's not by your works and all of these different things. I would rather get to heaven and be told that I was too gracious. I don't know about you, but, and I don't believe that'll happen. I believe that as gracious as we think we are, as full of grace as we think we are, God is more so. That God has more grace than we could conceive of. God has more grace than we could conceptualize of. That God is, I was at church the other week and talking, and, I said, I don't know what it was, I was on stage for something, and I said, just as good as God's been good to us, and just as good as he's been to us, he desires to be gooder still. And I know that's not good English, but that's good preaching. He desires to be gooder still. He has been good to us, and the mind cannot conceive of the goodness God desires to show to you. The mind cannot see, right? The human heart cannot comprehend just how good God is. Just when you think you've seen his goodness, he shows you a new side of it. He's even gooder than you thought he was. And I'm telling you that we think we're full of grace, and the God we serve is full of grace. And just when we start to get a conception of that, this is what I'm seeing in my own life and my own ministry, that just when I begin to get a conception of the grace of God and the graciousness of God, I see that I haven't even scratched the surface. That I think I've begun to learn these things. And this is what we're going to be talking about today here, is looking at Jesus' ministry. But I want to take a step back, and I want to look at it, and I need to be careful how I say this. I don't want to divorce Jesus' ministry from the supernatural. But what I want to do is I want to focus on the natural that Jesus did, which opened the door for the supernatural to operate. Let me say that again. I want to focus on the natural things that Jesus did, which opened the door for the supernatural to operate. You see, because I'm just one of those, crazy Pentecostal people, man. I was preaching at church the other day, and I had something in my spirit to pray for somebody, and our pastor was up praying. He looked at me and he said, "Dave, do you have anything?" And I said, "Yeah, does somebody have this?" And they raised their hand, and I jumped off the stage. I ran and prayed for him. I'm one of those kinds of people. But I believe also that not only the supernatural component, but the natural component as well. That there is a natural component to what Jesus did that opened the door for people to receive supernaturally from him. And so I want to start with this here, that we have become so focused on the spiritual aspects of Jesus' ministry that we've missed the natural things. Let me say that again. We've become so focused on the spiritual aspects of Jesus' ministry that we've missed the natural things that he did. We've missed how he responded to the people around him. We've missed how he responded to those in opposition to him. We missed how he responded to those who weren't necessarily of the same faith, the same creed, the same belief that he was. And I believe that's to our detriment that we've done that. And so let's look over here at John chapter 4. We're going to stay here in the book of John for a little bit. John chapter 4 and verse 1. The first example I want to talk about is the woman at the well. And I don't know how far we're going to get here in this. We might just stay with the woman at the well today, and we'll see what the Lord has. But John 4, verse 1, therefore, when the Lord knew the Pharisees heard Jesus had made and baptized more disciples than John, though Jesus himself didn't baptize but his disciples, he left Judea and departed again to Galilee. And then it says that he knew that he needed to go through Samaria. And so it goes and he says that he came to Samaria, where Jacob gave to his son Joseph. Verse 6, now Jacob's well was there. And Jesus, therefore, being wearied from his journey, sat thus by the well, and it was about the 6th hour. So this is, right around noontime or so, right? This is the 6th hour of the day. This is the middle of the day. And a woman, verse 7, of Samaria came to draw water. Now, we've talked about this before, right? This woman, the Samaritan woman at the well coming to draw water. The fact that she's coming to draw in the middle of the day is indicative of the fact that she was an outcast in society. The fact that she has come to draw water in the middle of the day is proof positive that this woman has no state in society. Well, why do you say that? Because the middle of the day was the hottest point of the day. The women in that culture came to the well to draw water in the morning. You came in the morning when it was cool. You came at night when it was cool. If somebody's coming there in the middle of the day, they're endeavoring to get there away from other people. There's a reason there, and Jesus will uncover this later. So a woman came to draw water, and Jesus said to her, give me a drink, for his disciples had gone away into the city to buy food. And then the woman of Samaria said, how is it that you, being a Jew, ask a drink from me, a Samaritan woman? For the Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. So now she is instantly looking at this and saying, something does not measure up here. There's a Jewish man asking a Samaritan woman to draw him water. Jewish people don't want anything to do with Samaritans. They look at us as half-breeds. The Samaritan people, if you look at the history of it, the Samaritan people were those who had intermarried. They were Jewish people who didn't keep the bloodline pure. They had intermarried, and they had some of the same beliefs and customs as the Jewish people. But they also had some things that differed. And so Jesus answered her. Jesus goes ahead and he answers her and says, if you knew the gift of God and who it is who says to you, give me a drink, you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water. So if you really knew who I was, this whole thing would have been flipped around. The woman said to him, sir, you have nothing to draw with, and this well is deep. Where then do you get living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us this well and drank from it himself, as well as his sons and livestock? And Jesus answered and said to her, whoever drinks of this water will thirst again, but whoever drinks of the water I shall give him will never thirst. For the water I shall give him will become a fountain of water, springing up into everlasting life. So now Jesus he's breaking down barriers. Do you see this here? Jesus is breaking down barriers between this woman and himself. It starts off with she doesn't know what to make of him, right? That the Jewish people have no dealings with the Samaritans. And then it progresses forward. He continues to talk with her and says, well, I'm asking you for water, but if you really knew, you'd be asking me for water. And he's not talking about, 2 parts hydrogen, 1 part oxygen, right? He's not talking about, good old H2O. He's talking about living water, spiritual water on the inside. So he's building a connection here with her. And she says, sir, give me this water that I may not thirst nor come here to draw. Verse 16, Jesus said to her, go call your husband and come here. The woman answered, verse 17, and said, I have no husband. Jesus said to her, you've said, well, I have no husband, for you have had 5 husbands. Aha, there it is. That's the reason she's an outcast, right? She wasn't just, a single woman there drawing water. She was a woman who had been married and divorced 5 times. Even in a society such as ours today, to be married and divorced 5 times carries a certain weight to it. Whether it should or should not, I'm not even mentioning that. But to have been married and divorced 5 times carries a certain level of weight to it. It carries a certain degree of shame, and it, by the grace of God, it shouldn't. But it did in this society. And Jesus says to her, you've had 5 husbands, and the one you live with now is not your husband. In that you spoke truly. The person you're living with now, you were married and divorced 5 times, and after being married and divorced 5 times, you're living with somebody now who's not your husband. Now, most preachers today, right? Most preachers today, and I can say this because I am one, most preachers today would either tell this woman straight up, that she's in sin and she needs to get her life right, or they would be biting their tongue and fighting back that urge, right? This is the common thing here. But Jesus doesn't respond this way. Jesus doesn't look at this at all. She responds and she says, verse 19, she's trying to change the subject. How on earth does this guy know all this stuff? He's got to be a prophet, right? Sir, I perceive you're a prophet. Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, and you Jews say in Jerusalem is the place where you ought to worship. Jesus said to her, woman, believe me, the hour is coming when you will neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem worship the Father. You worship what you don't know. We know what we worship, for salvation is of the Jews. But the hour is coming, and now is, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth, for the Father is seeking such to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. Then the woman says to him, I know Messiah is coming, who is called the Christ. When he comes, he will tell us all things. And Jesus said to her, verse 26, I who speak to you am he. And then we find later on, she goes and she runs through the city, and she's evangelizing for Jesus, saying, come and listen, hear of this man who told me all that I ever did. What do we see here in Jesus' ministry? You read all this, and normally we look at this and think, this is the gift of the Spirit in action, which it is. This is the door open into this city here, which it is. But what do we really see happening here between Jesus and the woman? Well, I'm going to tell you here. And if you're getting anything out of this before we get into that, go ahead and hit that like button. All right. Well, Jesus, in talking to this woman, Jesus acknowledges her humanity. Jesus acknowledges the humanity of this person. Before there was ever anything spiritual done, before the door was opened for this ministry, before she went and was running through the town evangelizing and preaching for Jesus, Jesus stopped in the midst of what he was doing and recognized the humanity of a person that religion had outcast. Jesus recognized the humanity of a person whom religion had outcast. Man, if we could get a glimpse of that. Jesus didn't bring condemnation to her. Jesus didn't come and tell her, well, you know what, you've been married 5 times, you've been divorced 5 times, you better straighten your life up, or woman, I'm telling you, you're going to burn in hell. Turn or burn, fire and brimstone, right? He didn't do any of that. He acknowledged her humanity. He showed her love on display. He manifested love to this woman. And it was that manifestation of love, that recognizing of her humanity, saying, I see you. I know that you were married and divorced 5 times. I know you're a Samaritan and I'm a Jewish man. A Samaritan woman and I'm a Jewish man. That widens it one step even further in that society, right? He says, I see all these things, but I am not going to let all these things get in the way of me seeing you for who you are. And you as a person are valuable. You as a person have meaning. You as a person are worthy of love, of respect. I can treat you with common decency and kindness even though you're on the outskirts of society. It doesn't matter. If the church could get a hold of this today, I fear this is where we've lost our way in the church. When we have taken ourselves and separated ourselves from the ability to speak to people with love, to speak to people with humanity, with dignity, with compassion, with kindness. I've seen so many hurtful posts from Christians recently, and not personally hurtful at me, but posts directed at people who, maybe some people who are going through the process of deconstructing is a common term, right? Deconstructing their faith. And, they're going through and they're trying to work through, some people are very genuinely trying to work through their faith and understand the person of who Jesus is. And Christians are going to, certain Christians are attacking them for that. And people are working through some of the injustice that we see here in our society, and Christians are attacking them for that. And we've got Christians attacking people on the other side of the political debate, left, right, middle, it doesn't matter. Everybody's against everybody, taking up arms instead of stopping and saying, I see the humanity in the person across from me. If I'm on the right side politically, I look at a person on the left and I see their humanity. If I'm on the left and I see a person on the right, I recognize their humanity. We may not agree on the issues, but I see that they're a person who's worthy of being loved, of being treated with kindness, of being treated with compassion. This is how Jesus operated. This is how Jesus dealt with people in talking about eternal things, not temporal things, eternal things. And if Jesus could talk this way to people about eternal things, the people that he came in contact with, how much more could we do this with regards to temporal things? Let's look over at John 8, a couple pages over in your Bible. John 8 and verse 1. This is probably titled in your Bible something along the lines of the woman caught in adultery. My Bible says an adulteress faces the light of the world. I prefer to think of it as a setup gone wrong. We'll get there. Excuse me. John 8 and verse 1, Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. Now, early in the morning, he came again into the temple. The people all came to him, and he sat down and he taught them. So Jesus is in the middle of a teaching session. Verse 3, then the scribes and the Pharisees brought to him a woman caught in adultery. And when they'd set her in the midst, they said to him, Teacher, this woman was caught in adultery in the very act. Stop right there. Adultery, I do not have personal experience, but adultery, as I understand it, is a two-person act, right? It takes two to tango. I know that much. It takes two to tango. So where is the man in this situation? It has to be a setup here because it says, now Moses, verse 5, in the law commanded us that such a one should be stoned. But what do you say? This they said, testing him, that they might accuse him of, have something of which to accuse him. So they've brought this woman. I mean, when you're in a sexual act like that, right? You're having sex with somebody, adultery or not, normally you're in some sort of state of undress. So this woman is just paint the picture here. You've got a woman here who's dragged, naked, maybe covered with a sheet, through the crowds to Jesus, all for the purpose of a setup, for a game among the religious elites, right? They're trying to set Jesus up. And they're embarrassing this woman to do it. Jesus stooped down and he wrote on the ground with his finger as though he didn't hear him. So he's completely ignoring them. He is not acknowledging the woman. He's not acknowledging the situation. He's not acknowledging anything. Verse 7, they continued asking him, and when they did that, he raised himself up and said to them, He who is without sin among you, let him cast the first stone. So, all right, Moses' law says to stone her, if you've never sinned, go ahead and throw the first stone. And then the Bible says that then he stooped down again and wrote on the ground, and those who heard it, being convicted by their conscience, there we go, went out one by one, beginning with the oldest to the youngest. And Jesus was left alone and the woman standing with him. So now all these people who brought her there, Uh, Jesus said, you can stone her if you want. The prerequisite is that you've never committed a sin yourself. He's raising their standard. Now, verse 10, when Jesus raised himself up and he saw no one but the woman, he said this to her, "Woman, where are these accusers of yours? Has no one condemned you?" She said, "No one, Lord." And he said to her, "Neither do I condemn you. Now go and sin no more." And Jesus spoke to him again, saying, "I am the light of the world. He who follows me shall not walk in darkness, but have the light of life." Now, notice Jesus' response here. Jesus has a woman who's dragged, like we said, naked before him in an embarrassing position, right? Jesus has every opportunity to humiliate this woman. Jesus has every opportunity to look at this woman and to say, "You're guilty. Why are you committing adultery? You know that it's wrong to sleep with somebody you're not married to. Moses said you're not supposed to do this," but he doesn't do that. Instead, he flips the script. He flips the script and he looks at those who brought her there and he said, "If you've never sinned, you can cast the first stone." And then when they all leave, the one who had the ability to cast the stone set her free and said, "Go and sin no more." This is what we wrote about the other week, that with the grace and the mercy of God, that you deserve punishment. She deserved a punishment here, right? According to the law, it was believed that she deserved punishment. The only person who has the right to condemn her instead chose to justify her, to declare her in right standing. "You're free. I'm not condemning you. Go and sin no more. You're free. I see that you were brought here unjustly. I'm not condemning you. Go and get this straightened out." Because really the problem here is that you're sleeping with somebody you're not married to. You don't need to be doing that. Jesus sees the humanity of this woman in her hour of distress, in her hour of need, and he recognizes it and brings grace and mercy and compassion to a person who's hurting and needs it. Mark 5. I hope you're getting something out of this today. I know this is kind of a different approach here, but I believe this is an important foundation as we dive into these other things. Mark 5 and verse 25. It says, "Now a certain woman had a flow of blood for 12 years. She'd suffered many things from many physicians, spent all she had, was no better, but rather grew worse." So she's been hemorrhaging for 12 years. She's just bleeding for 12 years. There's this nonstop blood, just going and going and going and going. Sees doctors, spends every dime that she has on every treatment, every quack therapy, whatever it is that's out there. She is doing whatever she can to get her needs met. Verse 27, she heard about Jesus. She came behind him in the crowd and touched his garment, for she said, "If only I may touch his clothes, I shall be made well." Immediately, the fountain of her blood was dried up, and she felt in her body she was healed of the affliction. Verse 30, Jesus, immediately knowing in himself power had gone out of him, turned around in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" The disciples responded and said, "Jesus, you see there's a whole crowd of people here around you, and you're surprised that somebody touched you?" And he looked around to see her who had done the thing. The woman, fearing and trembling, knowing what happened, came down and fell before him and told him the whole story. And he said this to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your affliction." Now, this at first glance doesn't strike you as Jesus meeting her natural needs, looking to the natural, but you need to understand the law of Moses here. You need to understand the Israelite law at this time period. She was not allowed to be in a crowd. She was not allowed to be there as she was because according to the law, she was unclean. According to the law, she could be stoned for touching people. I mean, when you're in a crowd of people, you're there, and a lot of us haven't had chances to be in crowds, since 2019 with everything going on. But I've been at concerts and things like that, and you're there, and you're shoulder to shoulder with people. And if you're trying to get down front, you just gotta kind of try to squeeze. "Oh, excuse me. Oh, pardon me," and you squeeze your way through, right? And I can just picture her. Remember, this is the crowd pressing in. The King James says that it was through the press. The crowd is pressing in around Jesus. That they're pushing in around Jesus. That they're trying and trying and trying all to get there. And she's fighting her way through those people to come up and have the chance to touch him. According to the law, she should be stoned. But Jesus sees a woman in need, sees a woman who gets her needs met, and Jesus tells her to go her way. He sees the humanity here. He sees the human situation that while, yes, the action is technically wrong according to the law of Moses, she was a person in desperate need of assistance. She was a person in desperate need of love. She was a person in desperate need of healing. She didn't need to be mocked and ridiculed in that moment. She didn't need to be told that, I can't believe you broke the law of Moses. I can't believe that you went out and you did this, that you broke the law of Moses and you put all these other people, you made them all unclean. No. Jesus wasn't interested in that at all. He saw a woman who violated the law of Moses to get a touch from the master. And he saw the humanity in her, that she was desperate, that she had spent every penny she had. And he recognized that and then turned and said to her, go your way. Daughter, your faith has made you whole. Go in peace and be healed of your affliction. Luke 7, this is the last passage here we're going to look at on this, and then we'll wrap it up here for today. Luke 7 and verse 1. Looking at the centurion's servant here. Luke 7 and verse 1, it says this. Now when he concluded all his sayings in the hearing of the people, he entered Capernaum. And a certain centurion's servant who was dear to him was sick and ready to die. When he heard of Jesus, he sent elders to the Jews, pleading with him to come and heal his servant. And when they came to Jesus, they begged him earnestly that the one for whom he should do this was deserving, quote, verse 5, for he loves our nation, he's built us a synagogue, end quote. Verse 6, Jesus went with them, and when he was not far from the house, the centurion sent servants to him. So Jesus is already here. You can already see the recognition of the human element in action here, the grace of God in action here. How do you say that? How do you see that? Remember in the book of Acts, just like we talked about the other week, that it was a big deal for Peter to go to a non-Jewish man's house. That it was a big deal for Peter to go to somebody's house who didn't follow the law of Moses. And when they came to Jesus and said, this man is sick and he needs your attention, that he's, he needs to be healed, Jesus went to this man's house. He was on his way to the centurion's house. This man doesn't keep kosher law. This man isn't Jewish. He doesn't do any of these things, but Jesus didn't care. He saw the humanity in the situation. He recognized the human need in this sick world around us, in this dead and dying world. He saw the need for love, the need for compassion, and the opportunity to manifest himself on this man's behalf. Then Jesus went with them, and when he was already not afar off, the centurion sent friends to him, saying, Lord, do not trouble yourself. I'm not worthy that you should come under my roof. Therefore, I didn't even think to myself worthy to come to you. But just say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I'm a man under authority, having soldiers under me. I say to one, go, and he goes. To another, come, and he comes. To my servant, do this, and he does it. And when Jesus heard these things... When Jesus heard these things, he marveled at him. He turned to the crowd and he said this, I say to you, I have not found such great faith, not even in Israel. And those who were sent returned to the house and found that the servant was well who had been sick. And so Jesus, again, in an effort to keep the man's dignity intact, the man felt ashamed to have Jesus in his presence, to have him come into his house. And in an effort to keep his dignity intact as a person, said, fine. He's healed. I'll do it the way you want me to do it here. He's healed. In all these situations, before we see the operation of the supernatural, before we see the operation of the spiritual thing take place, Jesus did something in the natural. He kept sight of their humanity. If they were in a position such as the woman at the well or the woman caught in adultery, where they were on the fringes, on the outskirts, the woman with the issue of blood, he saw the humanity in the person. He recognized the human need regardless of situation, regardless of religion, of creed, of race, of ethnicity, of gender, of any of these things. Jesus sees a Samaritan woman. That's important, that she's both a Samaritan and a woman. There's a racial component. There's a religious component. There's a gender component. All these reasons, according to the society at the time, that Jesus should not minister to her. And Jesus chose instead to look completely beyond those and say, I don't need to concern myself with those. Let me see the person in front of me. And it was recognition of the humanity of these people, recognizing the human need, recognizing the needs of the human heart, that opened the door and allowed Jesus to minister spiritually. Luke 18, we'll close here. Luke 18. And verse 9. Luke 18, verse 9. He spoke this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous, and they despised others. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood and prayed thus with himself, God, I thank you that I'm not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even as this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I possess. Verse 13, the tax collector, standing afar off, would not so much as raise his eyes to heaven, but he beat his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. You know, in the church, in the church, it pains me to say that we've become so divided that we find ourselves on the side of the religious person there. We find ourselves on that side rather than on the side of the tax collector. We paint ourselves up that, God, we're so holy, we're so righteous. We turn everything into an us versus them argument between the Christian and non-Christian, Republican and Democrat, and straight and gay and lesbian, bisexual, everything, America versus everybody else. All of these ins and out groups and categories and butting heads with each other and fighting each other and trying to show why we're so superior to everyone else around us, instead of recognizing the humanity of the person across the table from you. Instead of recognizing the humanity of your neighbor, the humanity of your Muslim neighbor, the humanity of your Buddhist neighbor. Instead of looking at them and saying, that's a person who needs love. That's a person, the humanity of your Democrat neighbor, of your Republican neighbor. That's a person who needs grace, who needs peace, who needs the love that I have on the inside of me from God Himself. They are in desperate need of it too. And until we recognize it, that it's not by our own ability to measure up, that it's not by our own law keeping, our tithing, our all these things that this law keeper mentioned here. But it's just the fact that God's been merciful to us, that we've received mercy. Until we begin to recognize the humanity of those on the other side of us, on the other side of every issue. I said on the other side of every issue. Until we begin to recognize their humanity, we will not be able to replicate the ministry of Jesus. We must recognize the humanity of others. It's time to stop playing games with this. It's time to stop dancing around the subject. It is time for us to get back to being like Jesus, full of grace and truth, to ministering like Jesus, recognizing the humanity of a person, recognizing their value as an individual, regardless of their story, regardless of who they are. You know, that's, and I'm meddling here, forgive me, but that's one of the dangers in social media. You know, we see all these things from all these other people. It's great in that it connects us, but it is so tempting to see somebody typing something up and just think of them as just somebody where you can fire your thoughts off into the void at, and not recognizing there's a person on the other end of that keyboard that you're responding to. There's a person on the other end of that screen reading your words. And what kind of picture of Jesus are we painting? I don't know about you, but I'm endeavoring to paint a picture of a Jesus who recognizes the humanity of a person, who recognizes a woman caught in the midst of adultery and says, I love you, I forgive you, go and sin no more. Who sees a woman who's been married and divorced 5 times and says, I value you. You still have something to offer. And she goes out and becomes an evangelist for him. That's the kind of Jesus that I want to serve. That's the kind of ministry that I desire to show. That's the kind of ministry that I desire to live. I desire to walk out. And I believe that as we do those things, we will open the door to a greater occurrence of the healings, of the miracles, of the signs and wonders, of the things that people in the circles that I've grown up with have desired to see for years and years. But until we start with being full of grace and recognizing the humanity of other people, I don't believe we'll get there. Amen. Hey, thank you so much for joining us. If you'd like to join the Grace Tribe, where you're the first one to know about everything going on in this ministry, or if you feel the Lord's calling you to support this ministry financially, I've got links in the description below. And if you've ever wondered how on earth you can receive from God, I want you to click on this video right here.